The macroeconomic impacts of export trade. Good day, everyone. I'll be talking today on the macroeconomic impacts of export trade, the ripple effect of a spending economy. We live in a dynamic world. Actions cause reactions. One change can set off a series of other shifts. Consequences ripple out. The economy is certainly no exception. As a society becomes increasingly globalized, the economic growth part of any one particular country relies more and more on the success or failure of other countries, particularly that of trading partners. Predominantly in our world today, nothing can be done without an exchange of some value for value, which is money, ideas, products, and technology, as well as intellectual property. As a result of this, there's a direct effect on the economy of any nation, either positively or negatively. Early economists embraced the labor theory of value as a way of understanding how prices are determined. The concept of comparative advantage developed during this early period and thus relied at first on this now discarded theory of value. The classical economists made a comparative analysis of what goods will be traded between two countries as against what goods will be traded within the country. This creates a school of thought that there is a difference between the country value of a commodity traded within countries and that traded with other countries, within one country and that traded with other countries. Whereas a wage tends towards equality within a country, thereby resulting in the prices of goods equal being directly proportional, portioned by the cost of labor. This factor is quite different in trade between nations, and since the factors of production are immobile internationally, the cheaper production of goods in one country as against another will result in the advantaged country preferring to export the commodities that give them the best advantage. This is a major factor in achieving trade balance, which is very fundamental to enable economic sustainability. The international trade allows countries to expand their markets to access goods, services, and intellectual property that otherwise may not have been available domestically. Trade balance is very fundamental to enable economic. International trade refers to the exchange of goods and services between countries. In simple words, it means the export and import of goods and services and intellectual property. International trade allows countries to market services and intellectual property that otherwise may not have been available domestically. What is import and export? Imports are goods and services or intellectual properties brought into the country's residents, brought by a country's residents, governments, or businesses that are produced in a foreign country. An import is the receiving country in the receiving country is an export from a sending country. If a country applies imports are important for the economy because they allow country to supply non-existent scarce, high cost, or low quality of certain products or services to its markets with products from other countries. Money spent on imports leave the system and the economy, and that decreases and negatively impacts the nation's GDP. Exports are the goods, services, and intellectual properties produced in one country and purchased by residents of another country or the government of another country. It doesn't matter what goods, services, it doesn't matter how it is sent. It can be shipped, sent by email, or carried on a or carried in personal luggage on a plane. It is produced domestically and sold to someone in a foreign country. If it is produced in a country and sold to someone in a foreign country, it is an export. Where a country exports goods, services, and intellectual property, it sells them to a foreign market that is to institutions, individuals, consumers, businesses, or governments in another country. Those exports generate money into the country, which increases the exporting nation's GDP. Export trade. Export trade are incredibly important to modern economies as they create multiple layered markets for their goods, services, and intellectual properties. The fostering of economies of trade is a major function that determines a nation's say and strength in diplomacy and foreign policy between nations. In every economy, rising exports will help to astronomically increase aggregate demand and cause a significant horizontal and higher economic growth. The volume of exports is directly proportional to macroeconomic growth, increased job creation, national reserve increase, trade and exchange, poverty reduction, crime reduction, increase in spatial cohesion. Growth in exports will also positively impact related service industries and other socio-economic and commercial activities incidental to the coexistence of humans in every society. For example, the success of cocoa exports in Nigeria will help the local economy with local farmers directly benefiting from increased spending, which will then impact job creation, agricultural development, clubs and shops, increased trade and commerce, more employees earning wages, further increase the number of citizens' affordability to spend in the economy. The three forms of exporting are indirect exporting, direct exporting, and intra-corporate transfer. Indirect exporting involves the selling of a product to a domestic consumer or customer, who then finally exports the product in its original form or modified form to a foreign buyer. Every major economy relies on exports, production, manufacturing, and investments to balance trade and sustain a GDP growth and keep up consumer spending. Employment generated through export reduces crime because every job opportunity is a distraction from crime by an employee who would have been otherwise idle. In today's global economy, a lot of consumers have adjusted to being used to products from every corner of the world in their local product. Imports seem to provide more choices to consumers, and because they are usually manufactured more cheaply than any domestically produced equivalent, imports help consumers manage their strained household budgets. Excuse me. Key takeaways. A country's importing and exporting activity can influence its GDP, its exchange rate, its level of inflation, and interest rates. A rising level of importers and a growing trade deficit can have a negative effect on a country's exchange rate. Trade the path out of poverty. A weaker domestic currency stimulates exports and makes imports more expensive. Conversely, a strong domestic currency hampers exports and makes imports cheaper. Higher inflation can also impact exports by having a direct impact on input costs, such as materials and labor. More recently, tourism and other opportunities have been recommended by Lakinberg LLC to be incorporated into the global trades and WTO's definition of export value, as they also create GDP growth and generate income from other countries or their citizens for the host country. Importance of export trade. The first one is foreign exchange. The second one is international relations. The third one is balance of payments. The fourth one is reputation. The fifth one is research and development. And the sixth one is optimal use of resources. And we also have employment, economic growth, increase in liquidity, ripple effects. The macroeconomic impact of export trade. Macroeconomics is the study of the behavior and performance of an economy as a whole. It focuses on the aggregate changes in the economy, such as unemployment, growth rates, gross domestic inflation. The objective of macroeconomic study is to investigate principles, problems, and national income, price indices, output consumption, inflation, investments, international trade, and international finance. The most basic measure of economic growth is the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total market value of all final goods, services, and intellectual properties produced within a nation's borders each year. According to standard economic theory, macroeconomic determines capital flows, which in turn affects exchange rates and overall size of trade deficits. The United States and most other countries have three main macroeconomic goals. One is economic growth, full employment, and price stability. A nation's economic well-being depends on careful goals and choosing the best economic policies for achieving them. One country that continues to grow more rapidly than most others is China, whose GDP has been growing at 6-7% per year. The primary contributor to China's rapid growth has been technology and intellectual property. For example, most in China. Over the past decade, the developmental role of export has been appreciated from the fact that it earns foreign exchange, increases firm sales profits, lowers production costs, creates employment, earns international recognition, enhances reputation, and improves the living standard of both the exporting and importing firms' nations. Exports have long played a role in the analysis of regional economies, primarily through the concept of economic base. The need to export is predicated on economic reasons. According to economic theory, macroeconomic conditions within the country, within an economy, determines capital flows, which in turn affect the overall size of the trade deficits. In addition, economic theory holds that trade agreements between nations alter trade relationships and thus reflect on the composition of the trade deficits, but have little impact on the trade deficit's overall size. Laws, regulations, and policies determine the design of the macroeconomic framework, as well as the structural policies that drive the ease of business development, stimulates innovation, skills development, and socio-political stability. The volume of exports is directly proportional to macroeconomic growth, increased job creation, national reserve increase, trade and exchange, poverty reduction, crime reduction, and increase in special coercion. Transformation might be as simple as a new road. And then I quote, before we had the new road, selling our products and was one Laotian farmer who now cars from nearby villages can reach our village and we can sell our goods. According to the findings of the report published jointly by the World Bank Group and the World Trade Organization, the report says the role of trade in ending poverty, that's the title of the report, was presented by the former World Bank Group President Jim Yong Kim and the former WTO Director General Roberto Azevedo at the WTO's 5th Global Review for Trade. This is summarized as follows. An increase in developing countries' participation in trade has been seen to have a proportional relation to an equally sharp decline in extreme poverty worldwide. Developing countries now constitute about 48% of total world trade, a scale up from 33% in year 2000. and the number of people living in extreme poverty has been reduced by half since 1990 to just under 1 billion people. Trade helped increase and grow the number and quality of jobs in developing countries, stimulated economic growth, and driven increase in productivity. For the World Bank Group to achieve its simultaneous goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity, the benefits of trade must be extended to the poorest and the most vulnerable. This in turn requires a concerned effort by the international community, working with the private sector and government to establish and implement a comprehensive array of regulations, policies, programs, innovations, and financial interventions that will reduce the cost of trade and create a more transparent and predictable environment for regional and global commerce. The extreme poor are faced with numerous constraints that limit their capacity to benefit from the broader economic gains. Trade integration is extremely important, not only because of the boost of growth it can provide, but also because there's an opportunity for it to be executed in many ways that more effectively surmount the constraints and the challenges faced by the extreme poor. The significance of this is the link drawn between these challenges facing people living in extreme poverty and their capacity to benefit from trade as the key driver of growth. The four major leading characteristics of the poor that have a particularly strong impact on their capacity to extract the full potential benefits of trade are rural poverty, fragility and conflicts, informality, and gender. Each of these four characteristics the environment inhabited by the extreme poor and constrains them from benefiting from trade opportunities. Poverty abounds in many parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, where the challenge of ending extreme poverty is greatest and extremely dire. For the rural, trade and internal and external market barriers in agriculture and mining present real challenges to benefiting from this. Over 80% of the extreme poor live in fragile and conflict-affected areas, often dominated by revenues from high-value minerals and other natural resources, and are less likely to be able to benefit from the commercial and trade opportunities. Poverty and informality are like Siamese twins. The informal sector workers and the micro enterprise that dominate the informal economy are faced with major challenges and are vulnerable to sudden economic shocks. Also, women are often in the forefront of poverty reduction, and trade has driven in particular benefits for women in terms of job and empowerment. However, women are faced with specific constraints, both within and outside the household, which always make it difficult to participate and play major roles and gain from trade opportunities. The report outlines action points in 5 areas to address these constraints. One is lowering trade costs for deeper integration of markets, trade facilitation, including implementation of the WTO's trade facilitation agreements, as well as tackling other policy and infrastructure barriers to goods and services. Trade are critical to growth and poverty reduction. Improving the enabling environment, intensifying the poverty impact of integration policies, managing and mitigating risk faced by the poor, improving data and analysis to inform policy. Balance of trade. Balance of trade is the difference between the value of the country's export and value of the country's import over a period of time. Balance of trade is the larger and the most important component of a country's balance of payments. At times, the balance of trade between a country's goods and balance of trade between the services are distinguished as two separate figures, as well as the balance of trade in intellectual property. The balance of trade is referred to as the trade balance, the international trade balance, commercial balance, and the net exports, the ripple effect of a spending economy. A single action has an effect over several different entities. The ripple effect, which occurs daily in many small ways throughout the world's economies, creates positive and negative effects, which are largely unforeseeable. As world trade increases and nations work more closely together, the ripple effect's intensity increases. Various studies on international trade recognize trade as a vital catalyst for the economic development of a nation. For developing countries, the contribution of trade to overall economic development is immense, owing largely to the obvious fact that for development such as capital goods, raw materials, technical know-how are almost entirely imported because of inadequate domestic supply. Discussions of trade broadly and trade agreements in particular often focus on potential effects of income and employment gains or losses. Most economists argue that liberalized trade results in both economic cost and benefits, but that the long-run effect on the economy as a whole is positive. They contend that the economy as a whole operates more efficiently as a result of competition through international trade. Consumers benefit by having available a wider variety of goods, services, as well as intellectual property at variety levels of quality and price than would not be possible in an economy close to international trade. They also contend that trade may have a long-term positive dynamic effect on an economy and enhance production and employment. According to World Bank, liberalizing trade and foreign investment have reduced the number of people in the world living in extreme poverty, that is under $1 a day, by half, or 600 million, over the past 25 years, transforming global economy. A growth in the export sector, natural, human capital, agriculture, intellectual properties, and minerals, etc., will automatically create the ripple effect theory. Economic ripples can be big or small, and the largest can have an international impact. In 1998, when several of Asia's economies collapsed, primarily Japan, the effect came to the United States in both positive and negative ways. The negative ripple effect of Asian economies was a sharp reduction in Asian demand for US-produced goods because of the sudden lack of disposable income. Exports lead to domestic production. Domestic labor. Hence, export lead to an increase in employment in the nation. Apart from the direct employment provided by exports, there is also a spillover effect. This means that once export workers get paid, they also spend their money to consume goods and services. This leads to even more job creation. As a result, the entire economy develops. Economists often cite the example of China while explaining this point. The unemployment rate in China has been drastically cut down after the export-oriented policies were brought into place. A manufacturer, producer, or exporter with 50 employees will increase its employees due to the proportionate increase in the demand for its exportable products. Every employee became to the macroeconomic growth of the nation, whilst the central bank, the commercial banks, and the Ministry of Finance are the first to feel the impact of the inflow of the export proceeds coming into the economy. The larger part of the impact is felt by the populace. Poverty, hunger, crime, and inflation is significantly reduced by job creation. Quoting Sanjat Tarkar, that's the former CEO of the Euro Exim Bank Limited, cyclists apparently don't help the economy. A cyclist is a disaster to the country's economy. It does not buy a car, it does not take car loan, does not buy car, send his car for servicing and repairs, does not use paid parking, does not become obese. Yes, and well, damn it. Elderly people are not needed for the economy. I'm quoting him. They do not buy drugs. They do not go to the hospitals and doctors. They add nothing to the country's GDP. On the contrary, every new McDonald's outlet creates at least 30 jobs. 10 cardiologists, 10 dentists, 10 weight loss experts, apart from the people working in McDonald's outlet. Interestingly, every exporter creates at least 100 jobs to the GDP of a nation, while every export transaction creates at least 30 more jobs for the economy. An exporter, upon receipt of his export proceeds, reinvests in his income or increases production by expanding, employs more hands, pays wages, and creates the following. Employs Mr. A, who in turn has an income and can afford to pay rent, buy groceries, buy clothing, get a bank loan, possibly buy a car, buys fuel, or pay for transportation, pay kids' school fees, pay taxes, pays doctors, etc. Through this, bankers get jobs, teachers get paid from the school, grocery stores get pay salaries to their employees, governments generate revenue, doctors have an income from patients, the fuel attendant earns an income, landlord makes an income through rent, lawyers get paid to draft documents or solve problems, tailor gets paid to make clothes. All this impacts the financial system. The strength of the local currency, the exchange rates, the value of the currency improves. This is because more exports are done and more value is generated in US dollars. That's a global trade instrument, thereby edging positively or negatively with the local currency based on the forces of demand and supply. Export impacts the local currency positively, thereby determining the currency valuation. The economy is and sustained. The cycle continues. In every climb, the increase of employee earnings proportionately increases the rate of consumer spending. This positively impacts businesses and activities that depend on consumer sales and engagement. This guarantees an overall healthier economy and leverages more businesses and their sustainability, as well as enable them to thrive. Exports generates money into the economy, into the country, which increases the exporting nation's GDP. There are 4 fundamental aggregate expenditures that are used to calculate the GDP. They are household consumption, investment by businesses, government spending on goods and services, and the net exports. All these factors influence consumer spending, and a decline in the spending damages the economy. As it drops off, economic growth slows down and prices drop, thereby causing deflation. If slow consumer spending continues, the economy contracts. Gross domestic product is a broad measurement of a country's total economic activity. Import and exports are the important components of the features measured by the gross domestic product. The formula for GDP is as follows. GDP is equal to C plus 1I plus G plus bracket X minus M, where C is consumer spending on goods and services, I is investment spending on business capital goods, G is government spending on public goods and services. X is exports. M is imports. The summary: economic growth and development with their attendant benefits would be very hard to achieve if residents of an economy could not buy some goods and services from abroad, and most importantly, export goods and services to generate revenue to pay for the imports. The dynamic role of trade as engine of growth has long been recognized by economic development experts. It has an accelerating effect in achieving the macroeconomic objectives of nations, such as full employment, income redistribution, favorable balance of payments, price stability, development of local technology, diffusion of managerial skills, and stimulation of indigenous and entrepreneurship to innovation. Overall, export-led growth has been important for many countries, and the growth in exports can as well have a knock-on effect to related service industries. Exports benefit the country while promoting monetary movement and contributing to industrial growth, generating employment and income. Thank you very much.